Yo guys, welcome back to a brand new video. Today, we're going to go ahead and talk about macros in Diablo 3. We're going to talk about what they're used for and whether or not they should or should not be allowed in Diablo 3. So let's quickly start this video by going over what a macro is. So a macro is basically making one key press or one click do several things. So for example, I could set up a macro where every time I hit the G key on my keyboard, it would click in 6 very specific locations on my screen. So why does this matter in Diablo 3? Well, people often use this to gamble or to salvage their gear. There's certainly other things that macros can do in Diablo 3 as well, but these are 2 really common applications for them. Let's go ahead and dive into a few examples. So I've got a full inventory here, and I want to break down every single item in here by only hitting one key. So let's go ahead and do it. There it is, done. Now somebody might look at this and say, well, it's really quick to salvage your gear anyway, so I don't really see what the big deal is. That's certainly true for junk items like these rares and uncommons. However, legendary items definitely take a bit of time to break down. Let's go ahead and take a look at this clip real quickly of somebody breaking down a full inventory's worth of legendary items in one key click. Clearly, this is a huge time saver. But outside of salvaging your items, let's go ahead and take a look at its applications for gambling. So a normal player might gamble at about this speed. A more experienced player might go at about this speed. But let's go ahead and see how quickly a macro can do this. So that's significantly faster. Not only was it a lot faster, but there doesn't even actually have to be a delay between one item and the next being purchased. It's possible to write a loot macro that'll just purchase a full inventory's worth with one click. All items will instantly appear in your inventory. With how much we are gambling and salvaging in Diablo 3, it's evident that this is a big time saver. At a competitive level, it's almost expected of you in Diablo 3 that if you're going to be playing in groups, you will be using a macro for everything that you need to be doing in town. These competitive groups are running from one greater rift to the next, and they do not want to slow down and wait for anybody to do any of their business in town. What's really unfortunate about this is that it almost makes it a requirement to use macros if you really want to play this game competitively. Some people may be able to find groups of other players and make friends with people who are anti-macro and may be able to get it to work out that way, but generally speaking, it's gonna be expected. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the arguments for and some of the arguments against using macros in Diablo 3 and whether or not they should be acceptable. Let's start with some of the arguments for macros. So the first argument is that macros should be allowed because nobody's really getting banned for them. There's very few instances of people online posting to the forums saying that they got banned because they were using macros. Now, I was able to find a few people online who claimed that they were banned for using macros. However, these kinds of reports were very few and far between, and generally speaking, the consensus of other players posting on these comments was that they must have been doing something else in addition to using macros to actually get banned. I'm a little inclined to believe this as well because I've personally witnessed people live streaming their gameplay of Diablo 3 and openly using macros. I've also seen videos from other content creators who have been playing since day one doing how-to guides on macros who still post content to this day. If Blizzard were really banning people just for using macros, it seems pretty evident that these players who are openly using them would have been at least suspended, if nothing else, at one point in time or another. Another argument that I had seen posted a few times online were people mentioning the fact that Blizzard themselves are not anti-macro. For any World of Warcraft players out there, you'll know that you can actually write your own macros inside of World of Warcraft. So Blizzard as a company does not seem to have any hang-ups about creating macros where one key press can do multiple actions at the same time. And the final reason that people are often very pro-macro, and this was probably the argument that I had seen made the most, was that there are people who need these to feel like they can actually play Diablo 3. So let me clarify what I mean by that. I've been gaming for just about my entire life, and I have pretty severe wrist problems. Now, I don't really use macros in my day-to-day gameplay. However, there are people with way worse physical problems than I have. People who have issues with their fingers, their hands, or their wrists may be more tempted to use these macros. With how many clicks that it takes to gamble or to break down a bunch of legendary items, I could could definitely understand how somebody with some pretty serious physical problems might struggle to do that. The intent doesn't have to be to gain an advantage. They could create a macro that gambles at a very human rate. The same could be said for salvaging or any other use that they could find for a macro. But outside of physical problems, it also just adds a certain degree of quality of life to all of our gameplay. It's definitely tedious to have to click something over and over and over, and so I can understand why somebody, just from a quality of life perspective, might want to set up a macro. But let's go ahead and dive into a few reasons why people are against macros. So first off is that macros require third-party software. Generally speaking, having any kind of third-party software that's interacting with Diablo 3 is going to be against the terms of service. I do think that it's hard to make a legitimate argument that using macros is not violating the terms of service in any capacity. Another argument against it is that it does provide some degree of a competitive advantage. Now, the amount of a competitive advantage that it's going to give to you is going to vary a lot based on what kind of macro it is and what you're using it for. But there are definitely some nefarious uses for macros. Let's say, for example, that you're playing a class that relies on 2 different cooldowns. Now, to optimally play this class, you've noticed that you need to always have one of these cooldowns going at all times. If you use them at the same time, you find that your character is just dying too often, so you need to alternate between the two to make sure that one of the two is always up. So managing this with button presses is definitely going to require you to keep a close eye on where the cooldowns are for each of these skills. So it is possible that somebody could set up a looping macro that would constantly use one skill, wait just enough time, and then activate the other skill, and then alternate back and forth. A lot of people online have tried to make the argument that the numlock key is effectively the same thing as macros in Diablo 3 because numlock will just use the skill once it's available to be used again. However, macros add an additional layer of functionality to that. Numlock is not going to be able to perfectly alternate between the two skills at the exact intervals that you need, whereas you can set up this kind of customization with macros only. So now that we've gone over some of the arguments for and against macros, I would like to know what you think. The purpose of making this video was not for me to give my opinion on the matter. I can definitely understand both sides of the argument, and it's not going to ruin my Diablo 3 experience either which way. But I do think that it would be nice if Blizzard made a bit more of a definitive statement on the use of macros in Diablo 3. It seems as though their lack of action in banning any people for using them implies that they're okay, while their terms of service seem to indicate otherwise. Go ahead and drop a comment down below and let me know what your thoughts are on the use of macros in Diablo 3. As always, guys, I genuinely appreciate you for tuning in. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.